Okay, hello. Testing. Hang on. Okay, so I think I figured out that this works. Anyways, hi, my name's Priya. I'm a second year student at Wadham, at Wadham College, Oxford. So I study classics and English, but I have a huge interest in politics, history, and journalism. I did history and politics A-level, and it's something that I'm still really invested in. And so the reason I chose to talk about Kashmir, so I personally come from quite a diasporic and multicultural background. My mum's side of the family are from India, and the first I heard about Kashmir was actually when my uncle went there when it was a war zone as a student, against everyone's advice, given that my uncle is quite white passing, and this was at a time where there were lots of stories of white backpackers, which is what he was, being taken hostage. He went to Kashmir on his gap year and sent a postcard to my mum and my grandma, and when I first heard the story, I didn't really know much about it. I was quite relatively young, and so when I was given the opportunity to explore a post-conflict community, that was the first place I thought to have a look into. And so obviously in the term post-conflict is quite a nebulous one. I'm very much aware that Kashmir is can be categorised as post-conflict by sort of the slimmest of margins. There's been a couple of ceasefires that have been unsuccessful in the time since it's been a conflict region since 1947, but there has been a ceasefire since 2021, and so that's why I thought it felt sort of appropriate to consider Kashmir as a post-conflict society. So I'm not sure I did in the article. I did my best to sort of briefly skim over the background of Kashmir, so I could focus on the main issue, but I might go into a bit more detail now to sort of help explain my process. So obviously the history of it is that during the partition in 1947, which was instigated by the British government, there was Kashmir was the region which, so both India and Pakistan have always, since 1947, claimed Kashmir in its entirety. It's a Muslim-majority region. Early on in the conflict, there was much more of a call for Kashmiri independence, but now I think since then, a lot of Kashmiris have expressed the desire, the majority opinion, to be as part of Pakistan and not India. However, the Indian government retains control there's two in a lot of Jammu and Kashmir. There is the main site of violence in this conflict has been the line of control, which divides Indian administered Kashmir from Pakistani administered Kashmir. So that's and both regions claim Kashmir in its entirety, they don't control all of it. Neither of them control all of it, which is what's led to the violence. And so obviously there's the big sort of one of the main contributing factors to this is religion. So with Pakistan being a Muslim majority nation and India being a Hindu majority nation, and the current government of India being with Narendra Modi, who is Hindu nationalist, and there's lots of I found that in researching sort of Hindutva, which means Hinduness, the idea that India should be Hindu, found lots of similarities to Zionism, which I thought was very interesting given the current political climate with everything that's going on in Palestine at the moment. But so there's obviously the main central tenet of religious differences, which has led to the violence in Kashmir. And I was wondering, and so that's what I sort of first went into. I found one of the first bits of information I was looking at was an interview that looked to be conducted by the BBC 7 years ago with Kashmiri youth who were saying that they felt the Indian government was hostile to them, that militancy was the only way of finding self-expression, and that they wanted to be a part of Pakistan. And that was 7 years ago, and that was my first sort of insight into, I thought it was really interesting to look at young people in Kashmir who have grown up with the conflict and seeing what they thought about it. However, I found, when I was trying to look for more recent sources of what Kashmiri locals, particularly Kashmiri young people, thought of Kashmir, I had this kind of, I found this sort of, I found it very difficult to actually find information about this. And I was looking into, one of the first places I looked for was Kashmiri social media influencers, and I wasn't able to access very many of them. There were a couple that I did look at, but a lot of it, their content seemed to not be anything particularly controversial or inflammatory, didn't really touch politics, which obviously I still enjoyed watching these videos. I thought there's obviously a lot of talented youth in Kashmir who are sharing their life and experience online in the same way Western influencers do, but it wasn't really giving me the answers I needed about the experience of conflict in the region. But as I was researching into this, I found some more. I found some more when I was looking at videos on YouTube by Indian, Pakistani and Kashmiri news sites about the reception of Modi when he in his recent 7th of March visit to Srinagar. I found that there were lots of there was, in general, the content quite anti-inflammatory. I found on, I think it was India Today or NDTV, I can't remember which one it was, an interview with young people from Kashmir where it was specifically focused on why they welcomed Modi. They had one person where they were one young woman on the panel who had originally opposed the abrogation of Article 370, which gave Jammu and Kashmir partial autonomy, saying about why she now enjoys Article 370, which I thought was interesting, and it was very interesting, and it was very important to consider the perspective that this was from an Indian news site. And then on a local Kashmiri news site where they interviewed locals, there was a bit of a barrier because I didn't speak the language that was being interviewed in the video, but I had a look at the comment section and I found a lot of recent comments of things of people saying, "I'm a Kashmiri, my reaction to his visit," and then a bunch of emojis for that sort of connote being ill or being sick, the green-faced emojis. Another one who said that Modi is a cancer to a lot of people. And then one that was very interesting that said, "No media will show the real Kashmiri people who are oppressed by Indian military, otherwise they will be killed by Indian government." And these comments are all much more in line with the kind of sentiments being expressed by those young people interviewed by the BBC 7 years ago. And it really interested me and this idea of censorship that isn't being allowed. And when I researched this more, I found that Kashmir had undergone so many internet shutdowns, and also that journalists kept being arrested. So I mentioned, and when I was reading about the revolving door arrests, where a journalist is arrested, held for a number of days, then let out for a couple of hours before being rearrested, that reminded me. I mentioned before how I did history A-level in school, and one of the depth studies we covered was apartheid South Africa, and so that reminded me a lot of a tactic that was used in apartheid to silence activists, is that they would imprison journalists and activists for a number of days, but just until it was considered to be an arrest. And then there was one particular leader, opposition leader, I can't remember in South Africa, I can't remember his name now because it's been a while since I took that paper, but who they released him, and just as he left the gates of the prison, he was arrested again. And that's what this reminded me of, which I think is much more sinister than the original, especially considering the overwhelming overwhelmingly positive view of Modi that seems to be perpetuated by the online interviews that are allowed by news sites. I also found that, and then when I found an article about Kashmiri social media influencers talking about how they have to be careful about political expression and stuff. But most interestingly, something that I found was both hopeful and as well as fascinating is that I stumbled upon when I was searching on Facebook to see what kind of online communities there are in Kashmir. I found Kashmir Youth Power Facebook group, and there are two of those. One of them describes itself as a news source, and I think that's sort of what it is, and it has about 7.3k members, so not and that was what it is. And the other one has 17.5k members. It's public, and it has the description: the group is about the freedom of expression of the youth of Kashmir, their intellectual ability to drive awareness, freedom of speech, ... And I thought this was really promising and hopeful because it shows that despite the censorship, and in the group you won't find a huge amount of political content. It obviously is a fear for Kashmiri young people to have to experience censorship, but I thought it was very promising that there is a space online where young people feel like they can express themselves, or are trying to express themselves, more importantly, despite all the internet shutdowns and the fact that journalists are being arrested, and it's very difficult to have true freedom of the press in post-conflict Kashmir. So I just thought that from my journey of trying to research young people's experience of religious divide and young people's experience of conflict to discovering the barriers they face in talking about conflict, it was interesting to see that the small acts of resistance in YouTube comment sections on Facebook can be used to help resist the silencing of the press and the fear of arrest in a society such as this one. I went into this story expecting to be talking more sort of about the conflict and about the kind of things that the sort of lasting impact of conflict, and I ended up stumbling upon a much more interesting story about censorship and freedom of speech in a post-conflict society, and it's really sort of opened my eyes in terms of, and given me a lot of insight now into sort of accurate journalism and finding the truth through different sources, and finding the truth in online spaces, which has been really valuable to me in learning about this. I understand now why my family was so worried that my uncle was going to Kashmir when it was a war zone, because it was during its active conflict was a very scary place to be, and while there are still acts of violence in Kashmir, it's promising that young people are finding ways to express themselves. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you to Bushies for the chance to explore this interest and express and to research more about this and understanding the kind of complexities of South Asian politics that I wasn't as engaged in before. So this has been a really great experience for me, and I hope the article has been interesting for anyone listening to this as well.